World Schools Debating Championship in Zagreb. Please turn up your mobile phones. Thank you. The motion for this round reads: this House supports the school voucher system. Debating this round are Team Scotland, who are proposing, as well as the Team USA, who are opposing. Please welcome them. The adjudicators for this round are Piper Whitehead from New Zealand, Hrvoje Kožić from Croatia, and Sayed Raza from Pakistan. Each speaker has 8 minutes to deliver their speech. The end of the speech will be marked by a double knock. The first and the 7th minute are protected from points of information and will be marked by 1 knock. The first or the second speaker of each side will deliver a 4-minute reply speech for their side. There are no points of information during reply speeches. Now I invite the first speaker for side proposition.
Up the exact phrasing of the motion, please, once?
This House supports the school voucher system.
It's on the ballot.
There are children across the world who will never pose for a graduation photo, sit in a boardroom, or have their voices heard in national parliament. Not because they lack effort, ambition, or intellect, but because of the size of their parents' bank balance. Team Scotland is proud today to support a system that will address educational disadvantage by giving poor pupils a ticket out of the tyranny of the birth lottery. We recognise that each country has a unique education structure in terms of finance and organisation, but the broad features of the policy we support are characterised by the following 3 criteria. Firstly, we define a school voucher as a sum of money equivalent to the average cost of educating a pupil in an administrative area, which families can claim from the government to put towards funding a place as a private school. Secondly, we support a system where such vouchers are allocated on a means-tested basis, specifically to target low-income families, as seen in the examples of Colombia, Sweden, and Pakistan. No, thank you. Thirdly, at the point at which private schools under our model are receiving public funds, we would expect a certain degree of state oversight in terms of them meeting basic standards of teaching quality and curriculum provision. Notice 2 things about the context of this debate. Firstly, while this is one type of educational reform we support, we do not think it is mutually exclusive to others. No, thank you. We are happy to support other means, but we believe that this method is incredibly important in promoting quality education for all. Secondly, we would characterise this as a reallocation of existing public money rather than a reform that would require additional public money. No, thank you. We think, therefore, in the absence of any additional funds, the very best world Team USA can realistically present to you today in this debate is a public education system under the status quo. Noting this, Team Scotland brings you 4 lines of argumentation. Firstly, talking about the injustice of the quality of education under the status quo. Secondly, talking about how school vouchers empower individuals. Thirdly, how they elevate communities. And then my partner Hannah is going to be talking about how they bring improvements to the school system in general. So now on to my main point of substance, the injustice of the status quo. The main contention that I'd like you to consider is that under the status quo, the school system serves, no thank you, as a tool to perpetrate and maintain social inequality. But before I begin, I want you all to imagine the daily life of a child attending a poor public school. It looks like the life of Daniel, a 14-year-old boy, no thank you, from South Carolina who has to go through a metal detector before he goes to maths class, where it's likely that the teacher won't even show up. Recognise that there are only 2 ways that children like Daniel can hope to get a better education. Firstly, if their families move to an area served by a better public school, but this is based upon the assumption that they can afford to buy a house, I'll take you in a second, in an area where property prices are driven up by demand because of the school's reputation for being good. Before I go into the second method, a POI.
Do you believe that the only way to be able to save students from this atrocious public school system is just to avoid and scrap the entire public school system in the first place?
We don't think it's scrapping the public school system. My partner is going to be talking about how this motion actively creates incentive for the public system to improve. What we're saying is that on an individual level, if we are ever to create social mobility and benefit these people's lives, they have to have equality of education, they have to have equality of access. That is why we promote this motion. Secondly, the only other way that you can get equality education currently is if you abdicate, no thank you, from the public school system altogether and go to a private school. Again, assuming that you can afford the high tuition fees. Notice the sickening trend. These are only viable options if you have the money. The status quo offers equality education, no thank you, to those with a family built upon the financial capacity and capital to afford it. If families cannot afford these paths, Daniel and hundreds of thousands of other children across the world have trapped in a public school system which specialises in nothing but crushing their dreams on a daily basis. Team Scotland believes this is a gross injustice, no thank you, for 4 reasons. Firstly, the quality of education that you receive is one of the most important tools that individuals can use to broaden your life chances and achieve success, whether that be through furthering your education or getting contacts to allow you to set up a business out of school. All of these opportunities that children attending poor public schools are completely deprived of. Secondly, these children aren't deprived because of any personal failings. They have simply lost at a birth lottery. Realistically, we tell you that if these children, no thank you, had been born with exactly the same personal characteristics but a different set of social circumstances, they would have the opportunity to shine just as bright as any of those lucky enough to be born into a life of privilege. Thirdly, no thank you, we think this injustice is made even more insidious in the fact that the socioeconomic inequality often overlaps with other dimensions of social inequality, for example race, because these minority groups have experienced both historic and systematic deprivation of financial capital to allow them to access a good education in the first place. Fourthly and finally, it is a self-perpetuating spiral when you miss out on a good education and you can't get a good job to raise yourself up and to promote yourself in society. What this does is it locks entire communities in a destructive cycle where there is a generational deprivation of hope for getting a good life. What we tell you is that the school voucher system will correct these injustices. Moving on to my second substance, which is talking about how to empower individuals. The main contention of this being school vouchers allow individuals to unlock and exploit potential that was unacknowledged in the status quo. We believe that our model rectifies the injustice detailed in my first substantive by giving low-income families the tools to experience better quality education despite the limits of money. Specifically, we tell you it targets students with a wealth of potential that is left unacknowledged. They are allowed to go to schools with better teaching and better resources. We think this comes with 2 main benefits. No, thank you. Firstly, you don't have to live in a situation where you cannot access your own potential or even realise that you have potential in the first place. We think it's an incredibly frustrating life when you realise that no matter how hard you work and how much effort you put in, your future has already been determined by the circumstances of your birth. We think under this motion it changes when access increases and you allow people, no thank you, to define their own future rather than it being defined for them by society. Secondly, the second benefit is that you can better people's futures when you allow them opportunity to access jobs that were previously not for people seem to be not for people like them. This is professions like lawyers, doctors, accountants. All of them giving people fulfilling careers and with that the attached financial security to ensure social mobility and allow you to improve yourself in society. It may be marginal, but we believe if we improve one individual's life under this motion, we think education changes life for the better. We guarantee opportunity by widening access to these people. They have the means to get a chance to discover and implement potential that they never would have before. My third point is talking about elevation of communities. The main contention of this being communities are elevated and benefited by implementation of school vouchers. Talking about the idea of minority elevation, because we want you to recall that educational segregation due to money leads to the ghettoisation of minority groups, as I've proved earlier. We think principally when you mix people in private schools, you can eliminate the roots of low-level prejudice that are based upon misinformation. Because at the point at which you have contact with these people on a day-to-day basis, you're in classes with them, you're friends with people of different walks of life, that is when the misinformation no longer has an effect on you. We think they're also represented practically practically at the point at which even if one person in a community gets to go to a high-level job that previously wasn't for people like that, that is a role model, that is an aspiration, that is what lifts a community up. Look, what we tell you is that school vouchers give society this raw potential. We believe in potential, we believe in futures without limits, we believe in school vouchers. All we ask is that you believe in team development. Thank you.
I would like to invite the first speaker of the side opposition.
We fundamentally reject side proposition's characterization that public schools are failing institutions beyond salvation. We think to the extent that there are some public schools with problems, that there are some individuals being left behind, the solution is to actually fix and lift up those public schools, not to abandon them and say, let's move some individuals to a different system, leaving all of those who are left behind in these institutions behind. We're so proud to oppose today's motion. Before I introduce rebuttal to side proposition's material and introduce our two first substantive arguments, I'd just like to clarify something in this round. Under our side of the house, we would use the money that would be allocated to vouchers to actually improve public schools. If there are indeed problems with them in the status quo, we think the solution is to directly address them, not to just move a few individuals out of them. We tell you that we would do things like implement programs to decrease class sizes, increase specialized advanced classes, increase the number of, say, specialized schools like magnet programs for certain subjects, increase teacher training and educational research. When cities like Cincinnati did all of these things, they went from, in 2003, being one of the more struggling school districts in the state of Ohio to meeting and exceeding state standards. It is more than possible to improve public school systems and the plight of every student in them. We believe that the state's responsibility is to promote the education of all children, not just some who end up getting vouchers. That's why we're very proud to oppose. With that, let's introduce responses to side proposition's material. They claim to have two arguments in this round, but their first, about essentially reducing inequality, was basically about how we move poor individuals to private schools, which is principally good. And then their second argument was about how this practically achieves their success. Note that this was essentially one argument about lifting certain individuals out of public schools. We have three responses. First, we think that this is a remarkably individualistic approach to solving inequality. They said that on their side of the house, if they help just one person, that's enough for them to succeed. But we think that this should go beyond just helping one individual. What do we tell you? That education is a public good, not a commodity that should be subject to individual choice. Public goods, as they say on their side of the house, are things so essential they can't be left to market to selectively provide to people. These are things like water, national security, and things like this. Education is a fundamental part of this. Democracies rely on individuals to be informed so that they can maximize the rights and resources that they use. And in its ideal form, anyone can take advantage of an education system to thrive in society. Which means we think what matters is that the public education system as a whole doesn't provide recipients exactly with what they want, but rather that the entire system of education can help as many people as possible. Just as under, say, a public transportation system, the government doesn't use funds to make sure that one individual can, say, buy a Rolls Royce, but in fact ensures the collective benefit of the whole. Additionally, we think because education is funded with taxpayer dollars, it should focus on benefiting the entire tax-paying collective, not just one individual. At the point where we leave public schools behind, this goal is undermined. Our second response is that we actually think that low-income individuals are shut out systematically on their side of the house. Even if they do restrict this to low-income individuals, we think it is going to be the privileged groups within those societies, say white low-income individuals, that are going to be able to take advantage of this. This is because hidden costs beyond the tuition that the voucher provides, things like transportation costs, are going to mean that the lowest income individuals are shut out of the system. Selective admissions that private schools often use are going to mean only those who already have an educational advantage can even get in. But our final response to all of their argumentation is that they assume that these individuals are better off in private schools. We think in many cases, private schools are actually worse. We'll explain this more in our second substantive argument. With that, let's introduce our first argument about how this harms students who remain in state school systems. Practically, we think the state school system is the most important consideration in this round. Why? Just empirically, it has more students. It is basically impossible for a voucher system to move every single student out of, if you grant them that public schools are low-performing schools. In Chile, the most extensive voucher system in the world, only about half of students are able to take advantage of this. In the large majority of cases, more people are going to be in public schools. But second, as we tell you, those who remain in state schools are going to be the least advantaged in society, who can't, get into a selective school, who can't cover those hidden costs, who can't pay for the additional tuition on top of the voucher. This undermines education in three ways. First, it decreases resources and students for public schools. When students leave the public school system, they take the funding that was attached to them with them. Unfortunately, this means that even though schools have fewer resources, there are some costs that are the same no matter how many students you have. Things like building maintenance, which means that effectively, because you have fewer resources, the number of resources you have per student decreases. But also there are just benefits to scale in public schools. If you have enough students to, say, justify filling specialized classes. This is why in Chile, when they implemented a voucher system, things like English and Portuguese programs were cut because it didn't make sense to pay for these for fewer students. But second, we think we move parents also out of this public education system. And the parents that would be motivated enough to fill out the voucher application, research private schools, apply to the lottery multiple times when they don't succeed the first time, are also the ones that make public education work. Schools rely on parents to do things like fundraise, volunteer, do things like vote in school board elections, and participate in educational politics to improve that system. When these motivated parents leave in a voucher system, the entire system suffers. But third and finally, we take away the political incentive to improve state schools because of exactly the rhetoric that side proposition pushes, that state schools are fundamental failures, that we really can't do anything to improve them unless we just give people a ticket out of them. This basically gives politicians, I'll take you in a moment, an excuse not to improve education. We saw this in Chile when, between 1981, when they implemented their voucher, and 1990, public education spending plummeted 30% relative to GDP. Go.
Do you in principle support private schools giving bursaries to academically able pupils from poor socioeconomic backgrounds?
Look, our problem in this round isn't that people go to private schools, it's the use of public money taken out of the public system to do this at the expense of everybody left behind. We don't think that that is acceptable. Private schools giving bursaries on their own are not our problem in this round. With that, let's introduce our second argument about how this actually worsens outcomes for students that do use vouchers. This directly engages with their material. We don't think these students are better off. First, there's less accountability on their side of the house for private schools, because one of the advantages of private schools is offering some degree of flexibility. Unfortunately, this also means that they are often held to a lower standard. For example, in the Netherlands, private schools' ability to skirt regulations means more private schools are classified as weak than public schools. But second, the success of private schools is often misleading. What do we look for when we're selecting an educational option? We're looking for things like high test scores, low behavioral problems, and things like that. The problem is, private schools often do well just because students are from wealthy families with an educational advantage. So when a poor family with a voucher picks a school because it has great test scores, often that's misleading because the students in that school are doing well not because the teaching is great, but because they can all afford things like private tutors. Poor families come from fundamentally different backgrounds than often the privileged groups in private schools, which means that those teachers and systems are not well equipped to deal with their needs compared to public systems that are more equipped to deal with more needs. This means often that students are worse off in these schools. This is why, since Sweden implemented its voucher system in 1992, test scores have consistently fallen for the last 2.5 decades. When Chile implemented its voucher system in 1980, its results also stagnated. We reject the characterization that students are better off in private schools. We reject the characterization that the solution to educational inequality in public schools is to abandon them. We're so proud to oppose.
I would like to invite the second speaker of the side proposition to deliver their speech.
Present your world in which they abandon clever young people in dysfunctional schools and condemn them to a life that falls far below their potential. Team America today defend a world where public schools have the luxury of being complacent about their students' education because they know those students are powerless to leave. Only in Team Scotland's world do we improve those students' life prospects, and only in Team Scotland's world do we finally light a fire underneath the principal's chair and give them that incentive to ensure that they run their school in a way that best generates the next generation of young leaders. Team America's case rests on the one flawed assumption that on Team Scotland we are leaving private schools in public schools in disrepair and telling you they're things that cannot be fixed and should be shunned. We told you from the very beginning of Team Scotland's case this is a debate about reallocation of resources. We can say that we want to improve public schools to the best of their ability, but when you are actively leaving the brightest and the most unpotentially fulfilled individuals in these schools, we cannot allow it. Before my first argument about why we improve the education system as a whole in the public sector, let's start with some rebuttal. So the first thing we get is a clarification on using resources, and they tell us they're going to reuse these resources in better ways under their side. Two responses. Firstly, we tell you in our stance from the very beginning of Rachel's speech that this is a debate about reallocation of resources. Not this massive amount of money that is now existing on this debate. We are telling you are taking resources that go into public education and putting it into private. So when they tell you they are making these systems so much better, we tell you it's already using existing money. We think they can't do it. On top of that, we have four responses. Firstly, we think it's very unlikely for them to be able to have this amount of money they talk about. We just don't think these are countries that have excess cash they can now put in these areas. But secondly, it's an illegitimate counterprop from saying that it's going to fund schools better in the same way that we could just say we could fund education systems better. You need to give us more analysis than that. Secondly, the kind of schools that are likely to benefit from these resources are ones that are not the most disadvantaged. That means that the schools that struggle are going to have to use these resources on more basic things, whereas the already kind of good public schools are always going to get better. Anyway, thirdly, we can still support on our side, as we said, any benefits of the state system and making it better in the long run. Those are not something that is mutually exclusive to our motion, because we think both can happen. Fourthly, on top of that, we give you unique benefits that Rachel tells you about social mixing and representation for young people that are unique to Team Scotland's world, that you never get from Team America. Leave these individuals in the public system alone. Then they attack, and under our second rebuttal, on Rachel's case. They tell us that they want to give education to as many people as possible, and that's why we think they can't stay with our principle. We have two responses to this. Firstly, that simple utilitarian metric doesn't work. The benefits we give you on Team Scotland are ones that greatly outweigh any of the minor harm you get when you harm the majority of the system. This makes America's calculation extremely unfair when it looks like America telling a young Sudanese migrant that he can't go to science school because of the marginal benefits to a few people who are already in a good public system. Secondly, even if we take them on that metric, we still win because we refer you back to the analysis about our role model, about positive cycles that get people out of social inability to rise up society and get better. We show you that you have unique benefits to communities only on Team Scotland's world because we are able to get out of these cycles and out of the poverty that Team America will leave them unique benefits on our side. No thank you. Then they tell us that the poorest individuals in these cases can't reach these school vouchers because they're not going to be able to afford excess things. We have three responses. First, we point out this is just a mitigatory response to an argument. If they think they're not going to be able to pay for it, they can see to the fact that it's a good thing. Secondly, we tell you there exists a full spectrum of schools that will let them to use these vouchers. This could be for-profit schools or non-for-profit schools, meaning there is different availabilities. Thirdly, it's in the direct interest of these private schools to allow for the most potentially unfulfilled individuals to come to them. That benefits those schools in themselves to get better results as a result of that. That means if they have students who are unable to pay the full fees, they're more likely to give more bursaries and to give more things. When they say in their PY that they agree that bursaries are a good thing to give to people from low income backgrounds or academic ability, they can see that the principle exists that people who are deserving of education, have potential that their potential is unfulfilled, should come into our side. That means they can see to the entirety of Rachel's case, when she tells you that the point of education is to help those individuals who need it most. When they tell you that bursaries are a good thing, they believe that if you're in an underdeveloped area and you're unable to fulfill your potential, you deserve to be in a private school. That's what a school voucher is. That's what Team Scotland are for. On to my argument about why we think we're going to help to state the school system in general, direct the clashing with the speech we just heard from opposition. Before that, share a quick information.
You tell us that it is fine to provide resources to a low-income student to attend a private school. Our problem is taking money out of the public system, where the vast majority of disadvantaged students are, to do that. That undermines the purpose of the state in providing education and means that you lose this round.
Let's be clear. Team America is referring of taking money out for one individual to another school. What they fail to recognise is that, in my case, that some public schools aren't able to cater to the needs of everyone. Their calculation of public schools being this good thing that helps everyone is completely unrealistic and not the real point. It is true that some public schools are fab places, they help individuals. For the majority of people, when they're already strapped for cash, they're already unable to help everyone. We think it gets better when you can take out individuals who can therefore leave more money in this situation. Let's be clear, they still don't seem to understand the reallocation of resources debate, meaning when they tell you they have all this new money going into the state system to help these individuals, they're completely lying to you at the point at which this is not about having excess money, it's about reusing the money we already have. Why you think their benefits are just not there. On to our point. The main contention of this argument is that through increasing the viability of private schools and the competition with public schools, we allow for all students to access a better quality of education, directly clashing with the point of information we just heard. Why do we think, therefore, that more private schools are likely to exist because of this? Currently, there aren't enough private schools. There aren't many private schools in them because the market for them is fairly limited to a restricted section of the richest population of society. However, by allowing underprivileged students to apply for school vouchers because they can spend it on private tuitions, open up that market significantly. It incentivizes private schools to expand and to take in new pupils and allow them to access that money. That looks at them building more infrastructure to accommodate and grow new pupils and new money. It also incentivizes for new private schools to be set up. This is because under Team Scotland's world, there are thousands of families that will now have government money to spend on private education. It's the amount of pupils that cannot feasibly be taken in by the existing private schools that exist. This means that private enterprises or charities are now incentivized to start schools to capture that wealth and to capture these individuals and these students so every school voucher recipient can attend should they want to. This is good because of two reasons. No thank you. First, we think children who use school vouchers are put into private schools with existing parents who are invested in the education of their children, so they push for the best options. Directly what they tell us in opposition to say you take the people who are most likely to help public schools out of them and put them into private. We say you help all individuals when you put them into a private system where there's more likely to be advocacy for better schools in general. Secondly, private schools have more resources because they can charge fees, they get less legacy donations, and donate thousands of pounds on top of their school fees. All of these things can provide better facilities and services to all these students. This is specifically important, as Rachel tells you, in the cases of ethnic minorities who are already extremely lacking. I think that's important. Overall, you have better schools available to them. State schools are able to get better because now they have the ability to not just they have to retain pupils. That means they can't spend money unnecessarily on things. They have to be doing the best for the education. Because they have more money per pupil, because they're not only having to spend on certain individuals, they have more money to use on individual pupils. That means you're more likely to have things like modernising the curriculum and restructuring teaching staff and making better teacher training, because these schools are going to lose their pupils if they don't provide a good education. That means, on the comparative, school systems in the public sector get better at the point where these schools have an incentive to retain the individuals they already have, meaning they can't be cutting short, they can't be slacking, they have to be helping everyone. On Team Scotland's world, it is realistic, you get the best for all pupils. Very proud of this proposal.
I invite the second speaker of the opposition.
The logic of the proposition is that public schools are already strapped for cash, and the solution is simply to remove students and put them in private schools. We think it is telling that the very same schools proposition claims are beyond repair are those filled with racial minorities that in their world probably would not actually have access to school vouchers in the first place. In their world, there will always be students left behind. And insofar as they agree it's about a reallocation of resources, those students now are comparatively even more disadvantaged, meaning none of their impacts happen, and the very stakeholder, the only one they claim to champion in the debate, fail more under the proposition side of the house. In this speech, I'm going to be doing a couple of things. First, I'm going to be engaging with all of the material we've heard so far, coming out of the proposition before then delivering our third substantive argument, and school vouchers worsen segregation in schools, hurting community cohesion. But now, let's get into all the material we've heard so far coming out of the proposition. First, let's begin with this idea of their model. Note that they give us a pretty abstract term of supporting average tuition fees for private schools. We think private schools can charge additional fees on top of the voucher and in fact have an incentive to do so to increase profits. This is precisely why whenever we look to Chile, they implemented a voucher school system, but 75% of them went to students that were at private schools already because private schools simply hiked up their prices to have more of a profit. The reason why this is important is because even under their model, low-income students will always be shut out. But now, let's get into the first question of the debate, which is, are vouchers an effective mechanism for creating equitable educational outcomes? We think the answer is pretty clearly no. First off, they assume all state schools are dilapidated and failing. Ella already told you we reject this characterization as true. For example, Finland continuously tops the chart for educational outcomes in the world, and they operate with largely state schools. But secondly, look to Barbados. It has one of the highest literacy rates in the entire world at 98%, and they do this through having government-run state schools. As a team of 5 students that all attend a state school, we think they grossly mischaracterize what this actually looks like. But secondly, we can agree, not every state school is successful, but vouchers eliminate the ability for those schools to reform. Ella gave you the example of Cincinnati, where state schools actually have pursued reforms and brought in massively better outcomes. But look to the example of California, which offered financial bonuses to schools that were low performing to lessen class size and hire more experienced teachers. Both examples better test scores and require 2 elements that vouchers completely remove. The first is political will to reform. Note that Ella already talked about this, but they never engage with this mechanism. We think there needs to be more money in education as a whole, but this is less likely with vouchers because of political complacency. But secondly, financial resources to reform to purchase things like new textbooks, better technology, fund extracurriculars, and hire more teachers. Those funds go away in their world. Vouchers eliminate both avenues under which state reform is possible. The proposition cannot also have reforms when they themselves agree this is about a reallocation of funds. But the third response is that all of the proposition's impacts assume that only low-income individuals will have access to vouchers and going to private schools will be better. We told you this won't happen. Among low-income individuals, it will be the most privileged. They have access to the most information about paperwork to actually pursue those vouchers, the most motivated parents in school systems that will know where these vouchers are accessible. That means under their side of the house, the least privileged are left in state schools because they're not able to access vouchers in the first place. But secondly, low-income students who transfer do not necessarily have better test scores immediately. Rather, what did we tell you? Oftentimes, the reasons why private schools perform better is because those students have access to things like private tutors, meaning those teachers
know how to teach students that have access to a lot of extra resources, time, and private tutors, but not necessarily students from low-income backgrounds. At that point, within the classroom, there is a discrepancy, meaning that low-income students are not able to be educated. They don't actually achieve any of their benefits. But on the point of information, they asked, we don't concede that private schools need public funding. That is at the core of this debate. But now let's get to the second question on this idea of the principle. They tell us it is enough to just have one individual benefit. If one individual benefits at the cost of the entire collective of students left in public schools, we think it is a gross mischaracterization for them to claim that it is okay. Rather, principally, we tell you education is a public good because you need education in order for society to function. That is why it is only the obligation of the state to look after this collective. They eliminate that with school vouchers. But now, to respond to this idea of the third argument that they give us on this idea of both competition and new private schools being created. First off, this is true, but the kind of private schools that are created are the kinds that want to make a profit. We saw this in Chile, for example, where vouchers led to more for-profit schools that are more likely to do things like cut costs and spend more on advertising rather than education because of this profit incentive. That means at that point, vouchers no longer go to funding classrooms. But secondly, we would say on this idea, remember the example of Chile, where more things were created, and afterwards, actual test scores got worse across the country as a result. But now, let's get into their third substantive argument. Before I do that,
Team Scotland supports any improvements to education. Why do you, therefore, are willing to leave students with untapped potential in schools that aren't necessarily bad, but dramatically limit their chances for any improvements to their social mobility?
We told you, you're happy to support public school reforms, but those are impossible whenever we implement vouchers for the two reasons I already gave you. You haven't engaged with either mechanism. Now let's get into the third argument. Note that whenever marginal increases happen in standardized testing scores that the proposition might achieve are massively less important than this argument about societal costs. Our third argument is that school vouchers worsen segregation in schools, hurting community cohesion. The purpose of education and the unique reason the state funds it is to facilitate liberal democracy. We want citizens to express their preferences in things to be able to govern them, but we can't do that unless they have the tools to vote and participate effectively. Schools for the vast majority of citizens are the ability to be able to interact with other people. Note this actually engages with their analysis about having more segregation in schools. We think education facilitates liberal democracy in two ways. The first is ensuring a common foundation of facts and a common denominator by which all individuals can interact. And the second is ensuring civil discourse. We think that school segregation is antithetical to either of these principles. Of course, society requires things like individuals to know math or history, but the thing that makes society truly work is individuals that are able to work together and separately educated people can coexist. Vouchers undermine this in two ways. The first is by promoting self-assorted dependencies. Given a choice, we think that people generally like to associate with people that are similar to them. It is more comfortable to decrease conflict and have easier communication. This means with vouchers, parents are likely to pick schools with student bodies very demographically similar to their own families. This is especially prevalent in cases where private schools already specialize in things like religion. In Sweden, for example, vouchers exacerbated segregation of immigrant versus native Swedish students in these private schools. And the same thing occurred in Chile, where segregation actually worsened along race and class lines. But the second reason why we think this is true is because vouchers don't cover hidden costs, and they also result in a lot of class segregation. Vouchers present a false guise of equality, but in reality, costs still persist. For example, transportation, textbooks, uniforms, food, mandatory donations at school events. All of this means that individuals from lower income communities cannot access the prime actual private education because of the hidden costs that will never be covered under any model the proposition might raise in their next speech. It means relatively better off students lose the ability to learn awareness of economic diversity and to develop actual understanding of what the lives of other people look like. They already conceded that the impact of segregation is bad. If that is true, that is a reason to oppose. Low-income students who take the vouchers then become burdened by hidden costs, either sacrificing essential resources or furthering their own debt. In either case scenario, they get left behind, society is harmed, we think the opposition wins the debate.
I would like to invite the third speaker of the side of the proposition.
let's be clear. Team USA's job in this debate was to defend the status quo, not a hypothetical reality which might be better in some suburb of Cincinnati, right? Look, in some suburb of Cincinnati. A status quo, which we told you in the first speech, actively perpetuates social inequality. Not tolerates it, actually perpetuates it. Creates the social strata, which has only been getting worse after the last 20 years. That's why trying to debate with Team USA was like trying to nail a jello to a wall. They never properly engaged what this characterization was actually about. It's not about marginal benefits to all right state schools in all right parts of the country. It's about taking the most talented and the most best out of the most disadvantaged backgrounds and providing those role models in society, actually fixing them on that liberal democratic term. They never actually engaged with that, and that's why they lost this debate. 2 points of clash here. Firstly, on the role of state education. Secondly, on community cohesion. Let's look at the role of state education. Because we get told right up at the opening that it's, no thank you, the duty of the state education to provide education as a public good that shouldn't be under market mechanisms. Firstly, we immediately challenge their basic utilitarian metric in this debate. Right? Because they tell us again and again about the benefits of the majority. We tell you that the benefits to that minority of students that we help are just massively outweighing the benefits with marginal benefits to the majority of students. Because let's be clear, what Team USA are telling us is that the Sudanese migrant in the banlieue in Paris cannot go to Sciences Po because his classmates might be benefited in a slightly less beneficial way. Right? We think it's really important to characterize that individualistic framing is also a utilitarian framing, and the point of benefits are much higher. We also point out we still win on the overall utilitarian framing because we provide you all that stuff about community benefits that comes out in Rachel and is never responded to throughout their entire case. Because if you're someone sitting in an inner city in America, you just don't see congressmen that look like you. You don't see lawyers that look like you. You don't see doctors that look like you. That severely harms your educational aspiration. That severely harms the actual material aspirations of the community that you're in. When we can actually lift you out, we can give you in the ultra long term a real benefit on our side of the house, which really helps them in that context. Those are unique benefits that exist under a school voucher system, when you also get social mixing, when you get politicians that are more sympathetic to the plight of working class people because they were in their private schools. You don't just have ministers going from like the top private schools in the country to the top universities to the corridors of power without ever having to interact with people of a different class from them. Only we bring you that, they don't. Right, so let's first focus more on this point of the role of state education. This is all the stuff about the benefits of state education, how it functions on our side of the house, right? We get first told right at opening that it's just possible for them to fund education more, right? They can just benefit things by like channeling funding in a more clever and sophisticated way. Firstly, we point out there's no extra funding in our system, right? You've still got the same money that was going to funding state education before, it's just being reallocated in a different way. So just analytically on its face, the point just didn't work in its original form. But they changed their hymn sheet a little bit later on, and they said they started sort of squirreling things a little bit, when they started telling you that these funding allocations just don't work in a certain way, and that it's much more possible on their side of the house to argue for this additional funding. We point out that extra funding is just inherently less likely as a metric, right? We're talking about a context of austerity in Western Europe, austerity in Eastern Europe, austerity in Asia. It is not the appetite to fund increased levels of education in the same level. That just means it's just not a legitimate counterprop for them to stand up and say, we'll fund education more and improve it. Because we can also stand up and say, we want to improve the state education system, right? Like, that's not necessarily a legitimate characterization. They have to defend the status quo and show unique harms of the motion, not just tell you that like there's a better reality on their side of the house. We're also really important to tell you that in that counterprop, in that hypothetical world, the schools that benefit the most are the best schools, right? It's the ones in the slightly affluent suburb that are able to use that money to hire the slightly better teacher, not the really disadvantaged school that has to use the money to cover basics and basic necessities, right? So even in their best case scenario, they don't actually fix the fundamental problem, which is social inequality, which is the disparity between schools. That was our analysis right after the opening. It wasn't accurately responded to. We also, again, refer you back to the unique benefits of our system, about the social mixing, about what I'll take in a second, about having those politicians getting that increased accountability and seeing those people they otherwise would not. They didn't respond, yes.
If you tell us that funding funding is most likely to go to students in wealthier communities. Under your world, where actual money is fixed, we think it means that there's going to be massive harms to the lowest income individuals left behind in state schools under any model.
I'm sorry, I just don't understand. Right, basically, if you're saying that you're just going to increase funding generally into the state education system, my analysis shows you that when you do that, that disproportionately will just benefit the most beneficial within that state education system. We showed you really specifically why, no thank you, we showed you really specifically why the school voucher system allows to benefit those handful of students, allowing for those role models, allowing to break that cycle of social exclusion. I just don't understand your point. Right, then they tell us that schools are harmed due to a bunch of things, including right flight, including a lack of political incentives. Let's deal with all of that. We first refer to all of Hannah's analysis, where public schools get actively better because they need to retain pupils. They need to stop them from leaving. That means you need results on the ground. Public schools aren't just looking to attract people on a really surface level. They don't have really simple profit incentives. They're actually looking to retain pupils that they already have. That means you need results on the ground. You can't just buy fancy MacBooks and say, look how much better our school is, because people on the ground need to see results. So therefore, it's in your active incentive to improve those education systems. You have a smaller number of pupils, you can target that much better. Right, and then we also tell you that school governments, generally speaking, do not want their school system to fail, right? It's also still in the incentive of government in order to actually reform their education system and also the house. But really importantly, we tell you that we actually have much more of an incentive to improve any education system in our side of the house. Because those students are leaving a school and their parents are sending their kids to a different school. They are not leaving a community, right? It's much easier to say that what you want in your disadvantaged school when you know what a high-performing school looks like, when you know how the curriculum is structured, when you know how high-achieving pupils tend to behave. It's much easier to have those aspirations in your community when you have a much better understanding of how schools interact on an individual level. That was the analysis that was presented in Hannah's case that we didn't get a response to in the last one. No, thank you. Again, we refer you back to our community benefits in that unique system. They then also tell us that there's less accountability in private schools, and that these schools often become bad because they're designed to attract large numbers of certain pupils. We will first tell you that this is a massive mischaracterization of the kinds of people that run private schools, right? We just don't necessarily buy that all private schools are run by evil people wanting profit incentives. We think you're often having charities, you're often having religious organizations that have a direct motive to try to attract students. You often have them maybe wanting to help disadvantaged students and having an increased incentive to do that on our side of the house. We just think it's probably a bit of an extreme characterization they brought you. Okay, the end strategic impact of that is we managed to show you where you get a better education. But let's talk about community cohesion, right? Because they tell us that the state education system is valuable because it promotes liberal democracy. Firstly, that's not the status quo, because the status quo is when you have segregation based on background, all the way that Rachel tells you. So if they're defending the status quo, they lose immediately on that. We also tell you that providing equal opportunity doesn't mean providing the same thing for everyone. Presumably, they support different education streaming in different kinds of classes, right? What we're telling you is that you can give those specific unique benefits by taking the most disadvantaged students, lifting them out, and giving those benefits, giving those community aspirations on our side of the house. That's the unique role of education. The end strategic impact here is that we managed to show you that a more inclusive society through those unique community benefits we can put a response to. We urge you, therefore, to vote on the side of this proposition.
I would like to invite the third speaker on the side opposition.
As a team that consists of 5 public school students, it's very easy for us to stand up here and tell you the real life story of what happens when competition is introduced into a market that is supposed to be providing for the collective. All it truly does is push out the individuals who can't compete because all they're trying to do is operate under a budget that is caring for the students at the most maximum way possible. We think that when competition is introduced, it looks like things where in New Orleans, ultimately massive amounts of segregation occurred because ultimately more people chose to go to one school, enhancing the divide between the private and the public. But furthermore, it looks like instances in Arizona where programs such as fine arts, programs such as language, such as better teachers get cut because there's no more room for it. Because a system of competition has to have losers inherently within that way, we think that that's ultimately extremely regrettable on our side of the house. in this speech, I'll be doing a few things. The first is highlighting one problematic assumption that has consistently been made by side proposition before moving on to discussing two key questions. The first, which side produces the best educational outcomes for students? And the second, which side best promotes social integration within the school system? But on to the one problematic assumption that we've heard down the bench from side proposition. We think it's far too late for side proposition to stand up here and now engage with what we've told them. We've told them down the bench that public schools are not simply this system that's incapable of being able to provide for students, that they're a lost cause, that they're not actually going to care in the long term. No, we gave you a lot of analysis as to why they're extremely capable of being able to care for their students, but only way of being able to achieve this is through actual investment, not penalizing them with a system such as vouchers. We think that when you looked at instances such as Finland and Barbados, where they chose to deal with the systemic problems that happen within public schools, when they chose to engage with federal money going into those systems to better them, that's where you actually saw tangible change, better outcomes for massive amounts of students within the public schools. That meant that everybody was catered to and nobody was left behind like that would happen in a voucher system. But we're even willing to engage, and we already did engage, with what happens when there are lower performances within public schools. We think that that's all the more reason to want to encourage more federal spending for them. Voucher systems uniquely take away that money, especially when they tell you that it requires a reallocation of funds. When you look to examples of Cincinnati, of California, where money was chosen not to go to a voucher system, but rather to reinvest within the system, to enhance the programs through teachers' investment training, through technological investments, through being able to update curriculum, that's where you see change. That's what we advocate for on our side of the house. But on to the first question in today's debate, which is which side produces the best educational outcomes. This looks like things such as higher test scores, positive learning environments, right? These are all things that we both agree are very essential to being able to garner benefits for students. Ultimately, two mechanisms were presented to you as to how to garner these benefits. Let's go through both and why ours is preferable, right? The first mechanism that we heard is the one from side proposition, which ultimately, from their own side, which we quote, is a ticket out of tyranny. They tell you that when you hand people a voucher, they're suddenly going to be able to have this choice to get them out of cyclical poverty, to be able to inform these students. Here's the thing. We ultimately tell you that this choice isn't actually an informed choice that is made. Why is this so? Because private schools have to operate under a system that upholds their brand, that shows that they're prestigious, that makes them look like they're the best schools possible. That means that they take money into advertisements, they take money into being able to make these campaigns so that they can garner more students, so they can garner more of a successful business model, right? Ultimately, that means that they're going to broadcast things like really good scores that people are going to buy into. But what they're not telling you is how they got those good scores. It's because they have wealthier demographics that can get things like private tutors, that can get things like more time one-on-one with their ultimate really rich and powerful families, that ultimately can give them a better education in the long term. That means that students who buy into these programs who are low income, who still have to probably deal with a job after school, who have to deal with transportation, hidden costs, all things that Ella and Emily told you, still are going to be hurt in this system. That's why we think that this mechanism ultimately simply doesn't work. We, as side opposition, gave you a lot of analysis and detailed descriptions as to why voucher systems failed in a lot of instances. Look to Chile, where a lot of instances of this happening only furthered the divide between students, hurt them in the long term, and ultimately operated worse than public schools. That's a unique reason as to why voucher systems won't work. But we as side opposition presented a far more preferable mechanism to being able to benefit for these peoples by focusing on everyone, the common good, the collective. We gave you 3 reasons why this is extremely justifiable. The first is this idea that we are using public money, we're using tax dollars. The reason why we have to care about the collective is not because, say, a few handful are going to get a great education under a voucher system. It's because there's a massive amount of people that are left behind. Insofar that a government has an obligation to care for the collective, to care for everyone in that system, they have an obligation to use money that is handed to them to betterment of all. But furthermore, we think parental involvement is a key theme. The parents that are most invested in their students, that invest the most time in school dances, school events, and bettering the school, are the ones who are going to buy into a voucher system and up and leave, meaning that public schools are left to deteriorate. Lastly, we think that a political incentive is slowly washed away on their side of the house, because now students ultimately are just told that voucher system is going to work, the government has no incentive to help in the long term. These three things are the things that make state schools successful. When the voucher system is there, it uniquely strips these things away. That's why you can't stand with it. Lastly, don't let them get away with this argument that simply public schools are unmotivated and with a voucher system they're suddenly going to be enlightened and ultimately work with competition. That's round losing for two key reasons. First of all, it operates under the mindset that schools work like businesses in the first place. No, they work to be able to just betterment of all people. Public schools have an incentive to just educate, not to make a profit like private schools. But furthermore, we think that competition is the reason why schools fail in the first place, because there has to be certain losers, and when it's people who are disadvantaged, when it's not a fair competition because you're taking money from public schools, you're ultimately leaving them to fail. But the second question in today's debate is which side best promotes social integration in schools? We don't necessarily think that education is restricted to tangible impacts such as test scores or other betterments in the long term, right? We think that you can actually get two very unique things. Civil discourse. We think that diverse settings within schools is how you actually teach children to engage with one another, aside from things such as divides in race or religion or things. When you grow up with people, you're much more likely to understand them. That's something that you uniquely get from schools. But furthermore, we think that you need a common set of values. You have to use these kinds of things to enhance society, to operate under a certain moral code, so that we can always keep a baseline of faith in society. The best way of achieving these two things are by having this increase of very valuable analysis. We gave you a lot of valuable analysis of this in our third substantive. We have to deny a system that encourages self-assortative tendencies, like private schools, that uniquely tell you to choose their school because of a religion, or because of a race, or because of a certain socioeconomic class. That's where you actually see greater divide. Don't buy into the argument when they tell you that you decrease inequality, insofar that we tell you integration does not matter if the poor people in a rich school are designed to fail. That's just faulty integration. We don't buy into it. We stand firm on the opposition. Thank you.
I would like to invite the reply speaker of the opposition.
Side proposition's case in this debate is effectively one story. The story of a Sudanese migrant struggling in a French failing public school system that's able to go to a great private school and succeed. They lose this round because they fail to tell you and engage with the rest of that story. That Sudanese migrant is turned away from a selective private school because he's at a disadvantage compared to his more wealthy peers. That he can't afford the additional tuition that the voucher doesn't cover and the hidden costs associated with going to a private school further away. That the teachers, even if he does end up in that school, are used to teaching the kinds of kids that can afford to go to international debate tournaments and don't know about the resources that he actually needs to succeed. Or that more realistically, he will be one of the millions of children who does not get that voucher and is left in a public school system that the most privileged people abandon. That people like side proposition think is so problematic that we should just leave it behind and reallocate resources to another system. This is the story of side proposition. This is why they lose. Two questions in the speech. First, which side does in fact improve education? And second, which side improves community cohesion? First on improving education, particularly for the most vulnerable. Their best argument and their main offense in this round is that poor families do need access to a better private education. They ignored all of our analysis about how oftentimes this is actually worse than the public education they otherwise would have received, because private schools are less accountable, because the reason they're successful is incredibly misleading, and those individuals in those schools are just more comparatively advantaged. And their own third argument, where they tell you that the reason that private schools are going to expand and more are going to be created is because precisely they want to make more money. We don't think that all private schools have bad incentives, but the ones that are created anew, particularly under a voucher system, for the purpose of increasing profit, this is their argument, are overwhelmingly for-profit ones that are more likely to be worse, that are more likely to cut costs and spend on advertising instead of education, which is why, as we told you, when Chile implemented a voucher program and more for-profit schools were created, they were worse in math and other test scores than the public education system. This was their analysis. Private schools are worse and get worse. But we also told you you that the most disadvantaged students are left behind in the public school system because they can't cover things like hidden costs. And even if it isn't the most disadvantaged, there's still a ton of people left in public schools, which is why that is more important. Even if the few people who get a voucher and go to a private school are comparatively better off. As they told you, this is a debate about reallocation. This is a debate about taking the money that you spend on one student in a public school system and moving it to another place. Even when costs in that system are staying the same for certain things and you're spending less per student. This is a debate about moving the most motivated parents away, and it is a debate about decreasing the, as they tell you, already low political incentive to invest in public schools. If it's already low, why would you do more to destroy it? We also told you that competition is a backwards way to improve educational performance. We don't think that public schools don't care about their students, and we think the idea that you have to take away resources to force people to compete is backwards. That's like telling a kid that's failing math, I'm going to take away your calculator until you start making A's. How likely do you think they are to be able to do that in a way where they don't have the resources to succeed? You are dooming public schools to fail and all the millions of children in them. That is why they lose this round on this question alone. But second, let's talk about how this impacts community cohesion. We told you, again, that it is the most privileged groups, even within relatively disadvantaged groups, that tend to leave these schools, which means that inequality already gets worse. But they failed to engage on our argument about how people selectively assort themselves into communities where they feel more comfortable when they have more options to leave, which looks like things where in Sweden, native and immigrant populations segregated after Sweden implemented a voucher system because native populations felt more comfortable just isolated within themselves. If you do believe their argumentation that integration is so important for a society to function, you won't pass a policy that allows more segregation to occur. All of these reasons are why we're so proud to oppose.
I would like to invite the reply speaker of the proposition.
It is clear that Team USA lost this debate in their very first speech, when they agreed that students who are not having their potential fulfilled should be able to be given a bursary to a private school. Let's be clear, from that point on, their entire case fell because they limit all of the harms to the public system when they too agree that the students with the most potential have the right to get the best education. So let's be clear, when they mischaracterised us as the team who left people behind, all they really stood for was the status quo where unfulfilled students are left without their potential to be realised and all students suffer. Only on Team Scotland do you better education, only on Team Scotland do you improve the lives of individuals. Two questions in this reply. Firstly, do school vouchers fulfil the role of state education? And secondly, do school vouchers promote social and community cohesion? To both of these, the answer is yes. In discussing the first, we were told that individual success isn't as important as attempting to raise all because it leaves people behind. Here's the difference. What we did on Team Scotland is we actually considered the wider impact of having an individual and having the opportunity to have success. What this looks like is redefining jobs that are accessible to communities. It redefines what opportunities you can have. It is futures without limits. What we tell you is that an individual success does not occur in isolation. It always occurs when a community is able to see that success and aspire to that success. Because when we told you that one person's success can engage entire communities in education, this is the benefit. The role of education is to allow access to quality education, to allow people to invest in their own education, invest in your own education rather than just getting a substandard one. The comparative is that our world is one in where postcode does not determine your prospects. Team USA only ever defended the unrealistic best case scenario where all students are able to go to decent public schools. When we tell you that we benefit people who are in the worst public schools, we benefit the communities, we benefit the education system, the system fulfills its role when it no longer perpetuates social inequality. That is where opposition fell. Secondly, talking about which do social vouchers improve social community cohesion? The answer yes. Because we were told that school vouchers firstly make schools worse, and secondly, worsen segregation. When we addressed this, we pointed out that they conveniently ignored Hannah's entire case, because we think when you introduce school vouchers, we say that public schools have the incentive to spend more responsibly, to keep their students in their schools. That is something that never happens under side opposition's world, where state schools become complacent because they are because they're the guaranteed education system for a lot of people. We have to light a fire underneath these schools to burn out the complacency that currently exists in the state school. That's something that only ever happens under our side. Secondly, on the idea of worsening segregation, I think this is a misguided point at best, because when we told you that principally the status quo is unjust because it shuts out so many people from getting a good quality education, whether that be through going to a good public school, going to a private school, this is the segregation that always happens under the status quo. What we give is opportunity, and all of the things associated with that. When you give communities role models, when you give them representation, that can only be a good thing when you raise them up. The comparative is that when the most powerful tool to benefit your life, to benefit your community's life, is now made accessible to you through school vouchers, that is when life gets better, that is when cohesion gets better, that is when society is benefited. This is something that will only ever happen when you give children the ticket out of the tyranny of the birth lottery, and this is why I'm so proud to propose.